Hi, everybody. This is Denis Tremorin talking from Pulse Canada's office in Winnipeg. I'm the Director of Sustainability at Pulse Canada. I welcome everybody to the webinar today, where we're going to focus on how pulses can contribute to sustainable food systems and some of the work that Pulse Canada is doing in this area. Just to note, we'll get started right away. We've got quite a few attendees already here. I'm sure there'll be a few more flowing as we go. But just a bit of housekeeping here. We'll wait for questions at the end, or actually even during. You can enter questions in written questions through the question box. So you see in the tab, you'll see a section, and you can write in a question as we go. So we're going to be using that rather than the chat function. Please enter your questions throughout or at the end of the presentation. And this should last about 30 to 40 minutes is what I have for slides. So I'll start talking just about myself. So myself, I'm as I said, the Director of Sustainability. I've been working here for 10 years now. And my expertise that I bring to the office here is in environmental science, in agriculture, and now I'm starting to apply it more to food systems and how can pulses contribute to individual foods or even whole food systems. And my background academically is I took undergrad and a master's degree in soil science and agroecology at the University of Manitoba here in Winnipeg. And I did work previously for a livestock company doing environmental operations for that company for 4 years. So we'll get started on the presentation. So thanks a lot for attending again, and we'll get going. So just a little bit high-level background here in terms of what are consumer trends focused on in terms of sustainable food. And 2020 is a bit of a different year for trends, obviously with COVID, but we do see when you look at sustainability as a whole, as a holistic approach, when you're talking about it's not just environmental concerns, we're also talking about social concerns like health. Health is actually probably the most important driver for consumers when we think about sustainability. But other things that are top of mind are things like local and recycling and waste. But climate change is increasing, and so environmental concerns are growing for consumers themselves. But we're also seeing companies making this a corporate strategy around sustainability, especially companies that are really focused on food and agricultural products. And there's good reason for that. If we look at agriculture as a whole and we look at kind of the global state of affairs around environment, agriculture and food production has a big impact on some of the key things that we need in this world to continue. In order to continue society and in order to continue having a sustainable world. So 3 good examples of areas that we could focus on when it comes to food production and agriculture is things like land use. So basically 50% of all the habitable land in the world is being utilized today for agriculture. And the rest is being used for things like forests and urban areas and grasslands and for fresh water. And we need to maintain the rest of that habitable land as non-agriculture because those non-agricultural landscapes provide a lot of ecosystem services. So we need to focus on our agricultural production area to ensure that it's sustainable and we don't need any more land. Another big focus area is water. 70% of global water that's consumed and removed from freshwater systems like rivers and lakes and aquifers is used for agriculture, and that's primarily for irrigation. So that's obviously, this is a big concern. When we look at Canadian agriculture, we don't use a lot of irrigation. However, where we do use irrigation, it's a lot of water. And then when it comes to carbon footprint and climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture has its space as well, and food. The numbers kind of vary, but depending on how you measure these things. But 26% or 14% can be kind of the numbers that you would see. And the reason why they range is that some people take the assessment and they include something called land use change. So when we're growing food, in some cases we're actually displacing some of that land use, which is being used for forests or grasslands, and that actually drives a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in itself, just changing how land is used from non-agriculture to agriculture. So that's why sometimes we see different numbers for greenhouse gas emissions. But at the end of the day, it's big. We need to address climate change and greenhouse gas emissions in food production as well, not just in things like transportation. So moving forward, this is why we see a focus on food, and there's a need to actually reduce the footprint of food. You see things like water, obviously climate change and biodiversity in terms of land use. Food production has a big impact on these things, and that's why we see companies like Nestle and General Mills and others around the world that are focusing on their agricultural supply chains and how they produce food, because it has an impact on the environment. And I like to use this slide just to show that we can't just focus on one end of the supply chain. We can't just focus on agricultural production at the farm level. All areas of the supply chain can make an impact if we focus on them. So things like how we market foods or how we formulate foods can make a big impact in terms of the type of food that we produce at the front end. And even things like, obviously, like waste is another one that a lot of companies are focusing on these days, especially in the food service area. And there's a reason for that too, because it makes an impact in terms of what we grow and what kind of impacts are out there. So we're starting to see people focusing on all of these areas, and that's a good thing, because we'll never be able to achieve the type of benefit or the type of reductions in environmental impact unless we focus on all these areas of the food system. And we do see this, what does this look like actually from life cycle assessment with companies like Barilla that have been looking at pasta, and they can actually tease out where the environmental impact of their products are in the supply chain. So in this case, from a pasta standpoint, if you look at carbon footprint, most of the footprint of that box of pasta sits at the farm level with the production of durum wheat. Whether it's in Canada or Italy or France, the footprint's going to sit at the farm level, just because of all the inputs that go into farm production. That's where all the intensity is for energy use and other things. However, also a company like like Barilla, may also look at providing information to consumers around how they cook their pasta, because cooking pasta at home also has a big impact. So if someone was boiling more water than they needed to for a box of pasta, it would maybe double that footprint. So these are the type of things that companies are discovering, and they're devising strategies on how they can improve the footprint of their food, either by addressing consumers or even by addressing their own supply chains, or internally by looking at their production system and processing system. When it comes to pulses, we've got a big feather in our cap for pulses. Dry beans, peas, lentils, and chickpeas all have that capacity to fix nitrogen from the air through this symbiotic relationship that they have with soil bacteria, which are called rhizobacteria. And basically what happens is that the plants have developed this ability to actually encourage these bacteria to colonize their roots, form nodules, and those bacteria are given what they need, which is carbohydrates and sugars, and the bacteria actually take nitrogen from the air, which is not plant available, break it apart and turn it into ammonium, which is then used by the plant for its own protein synthesis and other things. So this is the big advantage of things like legumes, whether it's soybeans, other oil seeds like peanuts, and pulses as a category. They all have some capacity to do this, and it has a big benefit when it comes to environmental impacts, especially greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll speak to that right now. When we look at pulse production, if we look at how much energy is required to grow a hectare of peas in Western Canada, we see that it's a lot lower than what we would use for wheats or even oil seeds like flax or canola. And if we and that translates into greenhouse gas impact. So very low greenhouse gas impact for pulses compared to cereals, but also all other types of proteins. So whether they're animal-based proteins, even a lot of plant-based proteins are going to have a higher footprint than pulses do. So that's the story there. I just also want to address here that when we look at some of these individual footprints, we also have to recognize that sometimes these are presented as global averages, and there can be lots of variability between production systems around the world. So in this case, beef has got a footprint of 50 kilograms per kilogram of beef. But if you looked at the Canadian numbers, they'd actually be quite a bit lower. So almost over half of that, which is some data that we have was developed by the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So just to recognize that the numbers can vary quite a bit between production systems around the world. But all in all, the end goal here is, well, pulses actually have a low footprint, even with that type of variability. And if we talk about Canadian lentils specifically, other pulses, we also see that in Canada, they have a really positive carbon balance. So on the left-hand side here, we show emissions, the type of emissions we would see from a production system of lentil production in Canada. So things like fertilizer and fuels are counted here. And this is the type of greenhouse gas emissions we see when we produce lentils, which is pretty low. It was very low compared to almost everything else that we see because we're not putting nitrogen fertilizer in the ground. But the other aspect that we can account for is that farmers in Western Canada that produce things like lentils and peas have reduced their tillage to the point where they're conducting no-till production systems. And there's a lot of carbon that's being sequestered in those soils. And if we account for that, the carbon balance of lentils across the country on average is actually negative. So we're producing at the farm level a carbon negative crop. We're actually putting more carbon into the soil than we're actually emitting in the production process. So it's a very big good news story for Canadian pulses. And we have this type of data that I'm speaking about right now for peas and lentils through an organization called the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, which has developed these reports. Ourselves at Pulse Canada, we've also taken a look at, well, what's the impact of pulses in rotations? And it kind of demonstrates that how farmers address practices can really impact things like the environmental footprint of wheat. So for example, in the old days when we used to grow wheat in monoculture systems of wheat after wheat after wheat, we would see a low yield with utilizing a relatively high amount of nitrogen fertilizer, or the same as what we would see today. And what this study shows through some meta-analysis of a number of different research studies across Western Canada and even into the US is that growing pulses and rotation as a practice has really effectively reduced the carbon footprint of wheat in our systems. It can vary between the blue bar, which is kind of today's regular practice, and the carbon footprint of wheat in that system can actually get to be very low if we actually tried to achieve the same amount of yield as we would have in that monoculture system that I mentioned on the left-hand side. So this is something that's a bit complicated, but I guess the end idea here is that practices matter. Producers can employ all kinds of different practices, which can lead to production efficiencies that would really reduce the footprint of an individual crop or food. And then again, the last thing I was going to say here is that local conditions matter. Just excuse me for a second. Local conditions matter. So environmental conditions at the field level, locally, things like how much precipitation we get, how hot does it get during the summers, how cold do we get, how long is the growing season. We can account for all of that and it can, all of these things help drive things, especially things like greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a chart that just shows across production regions across Canada. There's a big variation in kind of footprint we would see for Canadian peas, and that's due to environmental conditions. So things we call these regional units. So regional unit 29 and 30 in the middle of the screen are parts of Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta that are more dry and arid, which produce a lot less greenhouse gas emissions than other regions like 42 or 22, which are more wetter, warmer regions of Manitoba and elsewhere. So these local conditions matter, and I think what we're trying to account for here is like, can we actually account for these things? Do we have the data to account for them? And the good thing is, yes, in Canada we do. That type of data allows us to look at, well, what's the risk of certain types of impacts when we grow food in different regions of the world. And this is an example that we have with water use, where there's a model that was developed for the UN. There's actually a woman in Quebec who's the lead researcher for this model that takes a look at, well, how does it look like if we use water for agriculture in different regions based on local water risks, based on how much water remains after we take it out of the system. So I like to use the example of rice production here. There's two big rice production regions in the US. One is in the Mississippi Valley, which is bright blue, which means that water use in that region is very low. The risk of water use in that region is very low because it's lots of water, it's very abundant. And the other region is California, which is more orange and red. And water use in that context is very different. There's a lot of pressure on that local water system in California, and there's a lot more risk. So we can account for these type of risks as well. On top of just looking at how much water we use, we can also look at, well, what's the risk of that water use? And we're kind of applying the same thing with greenhouse gas emissions and land use when it comes to biodiversity. The last slide here in this section, which kind of focuses on food production, was just to kind of highlight that in Canada, we're using, there's an organization that kind of supports this type of measurement system where we look at these local impacts of production, which is called Field to Market Canada, which is a sister organization of a much larger organization in the US called Field to Market. And they develop tools like a field period calculator, which allows food companies, ingredient companies like yourselves to take a look at your supply chains and actually get producers to enter data and produce reports about what's the environmental impact of their crops. And in Canada, we've got a wide suite of crops that are included in this calculator. And there's a lot of supports within this organization to help companies like yourselves and your suppliers to go through the process of developing plans and programs around how do you measure and how do you make improvements in that supply chain, and how can you actually make claims at the end of the day around measurement of these systems. So that's if you have questions about that, I can actually make connections with your organization with this Field to Market Canada, where I'm actually sitting on the board of that organization for now, as we get that organization off the ground, which just came to be before COVID hit. So now I'm going to shift a little bit in terms of how do we've been focusing mostly on agricultural production, and I want to talk about some of the work we've done looking at how pulses can be applied in food products and how can they bring some of these environmental benefits to the food product themselves. So we've been doing some studies, but I just wanted to note that we're seeing a growing portfolio of products that include pulses and pulse ingredients. And some of it is including some things that are very specific, like proteins. Some are including more whole ingredients. But on top of the nutrition benefit of pulses, the other thing that could be leveraged is the sustainability of pulses in these products. And that's maybe the next generation of what we might see either on label, or what we are seeing quite a bit is companies using this as a corporate strategy. And in corporate communications is how do we position ourselves as companies, and what are the things that we can do to talk about sustainability. And there's definitely something here when we talk about pulses and these products. So just to get started, some of the work that we've done has started with actually with wheat-based products, and we worked with an institution in Switzerland called ETH, which is kind of the Swiss Institute of Technology, and we looked at these three wheat-based products that were reformulated with pea flour, and then further we did work on lentil flour as well, and we looked at if we incorporate them at these rates, which were provided by the Canadian International Grains Institute in terms of the blend. What's the nutritional and environmental impacts of that? So what we see in terms of nutrition is we see a benefit across the board, and that's due to the fiber and the protein and some of the minerals and vitamins that peas and pea flour and lentil flour are bringing into these products. And we used an approach called the nutrient balance score. We account for all of the positive nutrients and all of the negative nutrients like fats and salts that's being brought into these and are being changed when we reformulate these products. And then when we look at that whole score, we see benefits is kind of the end game here. And some of it is a little bit more distinct with lentils because you see a bit more fiber, for example, in the lentil flour than you would be for whole pea flour, because these are whole ingredients when we're talking about here in terms of flours. We also see a benefit with greenhouse gas emissions, and this is due to the fact that production system for peas and lentils produces a lot less greenhouse gas emissions than we would see for Western Canadian wheat, which is what we have used here. And of course, we see a bigger benefit to something like pasta, for example, because there's more flour that's utilized in that system, for more lentil flour and more pea flour used in that system compared to the pan bread. But there's something else going on with breakfast cereal. Breakfast cereal is using the most amount of pea flour and lentil flour, but we don't see the same environmental benefit as we do for the pasta. And the reason for that is actually highlighted on this next slide, where if we look at what's traditional for most products is you see most of the footprint sits at the cultivation stage for things like pasta and pan bread. So we have the same result here as what we saw for Barilla with the pasta. However, for breakfast cereal, it's a different story. The footprint of that product, because it's extruded, sits more so at the manufacturing stage. And we didn't, I'll just highlight this, that we didn't have the strongest data when it came to processing, because a lot of it doesn't exist. But you have to account for this as well. Sometimes the footprint sits more so at the manufacturing stage than the cultivation stage. When it comes to milling, if you're interested in that, it's very low. Milling is a quick process. It's low energy when you look at the tonnage of product that you're moving through. So, and then we looked at other environmental impacts too. This data right now exists for lentil flour. It's unpublished data, but we did see a small increase in the water footprint of that pasta and the land use footprint of that pasta when we incorporated lentil flour. And this is just looking at pasta, but the same results you would see. It would be a similar result for the other products. And the reason for that is that lentils have a lower yield than wheat does. So you need more land to produce the same amount of lentils than you do wheat. And that kind of translates into the water footprint as well. However, I'll highlight too that the water footprint of this product is actually very, very low. And so the discrepancy between the two is pretty moot, because at the end of the day, almost no water is being used in these production systems. The irrigation of Western Canadian wheat and lentils is extremely low. Less than 0.5% of the production system is irrigated. But again, we can apply these type of models to that water system. Like, what's the risk of using that water in the first place, even though it's very, very low, which is something we've done as well, but I'm not going to show the data because it's a bit too much for today. We're also looking at not just plant-based foods and how do we reformulate them. We're also looking at animal-based foods and how can we reformulate them, and what's the impact of including pulse ingredients in vegan products is something we're going to be we can start to look at as well. But to get started, we looked at something more simple, which is plant meat blends, looking at whole animal protein and whole plant protein, or whole plant proteins like whole lentils. And what's the impact that we see if we develop a burger product or a ground beef product that's blended with whole lentils. And this is a study that's actually been published just the last couple of days in MDPI Sustainability is the journal. So what we saw nutritionally is pretty obvious. We see a reduction in calories and fat because we're replacing some of that meat product with whole lentils. We see an increase in fiber because meat doesn't have any fiber. And we see environmental impacts that are reduced, and we see a reduction in costs. So I'll go through some of the details here in the next few slides. So in this case, we used a lentil puree to incorporate into a blended beef patty. And we used lean beef as our assessment. And what we found was with that incorporation of lentil puree, we saw a reduction in saturated and total fats. Cholesterol was lowered, and we saw a big boost in fiber, and some minerals and vitamins like folate were increased as well. So nutritionally, this product you could say is benefiting, and it's a better product nutritionally than what you would see just as from 100% beef burger that's lean. And we also saw big environmental benefits to including these lentil purees in these burger patties. And it basically is like a 1-to-1 ratio. If you include 1% of lentil puree, you get a 1% benefit of greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and land use. And that's just due to the fact that the environmental impacts of beef are quite a bit higher, or are very, they're at the other end of the spectrum when it comes to compared to lentils. So we see these benefits across the board. And this is for this data that we used was the Canadian beef data from the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and we used our local production data for Canadian lentils. So we got kind of local data. We also actually found data from the U.S. system as well for beef, and the impacts are actually more pronounced. We still see a 33% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and water use and land use. However, the beef system in the US produces more greenhouse gas emissions and uses more water due to irrigation than the Canadian system. So the impact of reformulation is actually higher when we reformulate burgers in the US with US beef than if we were to do it in Canada. And this type of data is actually being used today in a campaign targeting food service in the US. With our counterparts at Saskatchewan Pulse Corps, we're conducting that type of food service outreach. So the last piece, or one of the last pieces with this story here, is that in this case, we see a big reduction in cost as well. So from a food service perspective, there's a reason to use the things like lentils in beef burgers. Probably even this is actually more attractive than some of the other products we've seen out there, like mushroom burger blends, because the cost of lentils is very low compared to even something like mushrooms. And so if you're going to be selling the product for the same price or even just a little bit lower, you can make a lot more money serving this product versus 100% beef. So there's a kind of a triple bottom line effect, but you're also retaining, I'll also say, benefits of this product is you're retaining some of the benefits that you do get with beef. So lots of iron, that's still retained in this system. And beef has a good environmental story too when it comes to things like grassland systems. So that's retained in the product as well. So there's two stories that can come along and kind of blend together along with this whole idea of this blended concept. So this is actually my last slide for today. So you guys will have lots of time to ask questions here. But and I hope I didn't go too fast and I'm not talking too fast. But one of the things I want to say was this all requires data. And this is something we've identified from the start, was especially for pulses and some other smaller acreage plant-based foods across the world, there's a lack of data in public systems that allow companies like yourselves, ingredient companies and food companies, to do the environmental assessment that they need to if they want to. And so we're actually working here at Pulse Canada to ensure that we have data representing Canadian production systems. And we've already started with peas and lentils. So we've got a study going on right now with the University of British Columbia, where we collected data last winter from 700 farmers that included pea and lentil producers in Western Canada. And we got all the data that we needed, including fertilizer use, pesticide use, on-farm fuel use, and on-farm energy use. And all that data is being compiled and put into a system that can be published into these public inventory systems for life cycle assessment. So EcoInvent is a really good example, but there's others here, like the USD has their own as well, that we could publish this data set into basically the databases that companies like Nestle would use if they were going to look at, well, if we're going to reformulate our products, or if we're going to be using new ingredients, what does that look like if we use Canadian pea protein or Canadian lentils in a new product? So we're ensuring that that data exists, and we're ensuring that it's in the places where they can get access to it. So that's something we're doing today. We're also working with this global plant-based foods ecosystem, which is an organization that was started by Bridge to Food in Holland. And we're kind of marrying this data with more of a global approach around plant-based foods and protein specifically, and ensuring that our data in Canada and elsewhere gets put into one spot where people know where it is, and they know that the data is fairly robust. And really the end goal here is to ensure that companies can do the assessments on things like Beyond Meat burgers or other things that are including plant-based proteins from pulses, and especially from Canada. So next winter, we're actually going to be furthering this work by focusing on faba bean production in Canada and dry bean production to ensure that we have that type of data as well. So, we've been talking, I think I've been talking for over 30 minutes. That's pretty good to wrap this up. It's nice to kind of wrap these up in short order so you guys have time to ask questions. And I welcome your questions now, actually. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't go too fast, but regardless, here's my email address. You can always ask me about some of the things that I put here. You can ask me today, you can ask me tomorrow, and I'll look to get back to you. So thanks again. Are there any questions, Mary? Good. I'll answer them. I can't see them right now. Oh, you can see them. I can't see them. Oh, this is not good. All right. Okay. So they were asked if I got a question about can we get a copy of the presentation slides? Mary, are we going to be sharing that with everybody who registered? Okay. We're going to be sharing a copy of the presentation slides. Just so you know, this presentation was recorded, so we'll also be sharing that, a recording of the presentation. I also got a question from another question here. How does carbon sequestration graph take into account the carbon that is sequestered into the plant itself, and what happens to the chaff post-harvest? Okay, good question. That type of carbon is not accounted when we look at carbon footprints, and the reason why is that that's the type of carbon that we have in the carbon cycle that comes in and out of the system annually. So it'd be kind of like it's the opposite of you and me breathing. So we consume food, we breathe it out, but no one accounts for that because it's just a flow through. So the plant material that's left over after the crop, we assume that most of that is going back into the atmosphere. But if we change practices like no-till, if we have the studies to show that our soils actually build up carbon, or even through things like cover cropping, then we can account for the carbon that actually is increasing in the soil. So there's a kind of there's a distinction there. Just because we have chaff or just because we have straw left after the harvest doesn't mean that that's actually increasing effectively soil carbon. So that's the answer there. It's a bit complicated, but that's just the way that the International Panel of Climate Change has decided to account for things. It makes things a lot simpler because we don't want to account for things that just go back up in the air. It adds to the accounting of this, and it gets really complicated. I have another question. Have the anti-nutritional factors of pulses such as trypsin inhibitors been factored into nutrient balance score? No. When we look at nutrient balance score, we're looking at a suite of, I guess we would call them simpler nutritional pieces here. So whether it's wheat or any other plant-based food, we wouldn't be accounting for anti-nutritional factors in that specific type of assessment, which is if you Google nutrient balance score, you would find out that there's Adam Drusnowski from Washington State University was the publisher of that data, and you can find the actual methodology of that. So I think there's 3 questions. Is there any more, Mary, or no? No. Okay. So we had 3 questions. There's nothing else that popped up. So again, I thank you for your time. You have my email address. You can ask me more questions about some of the things that we've talked about today, including some of that data that we're going to be coming out with in the fall on peas and lentils with this life cycle assessment. And yeah, thanks a lot, everybody, for your time, and have a good rest of your day. Okay, bye.